Hi, this is Paul. As I mentioned in my last video, I wanted to do a deeper dive into the unbelievable, gotta get my camera set here, into the unbelievable Jordan Peterson, Susan Blackmore conversation. I think this actually was a terrific conversation, and there's a lot in it that I want to bring out, and especially now in terms of really, I think religion, let's call it religion S, which is the secular version of religion, and religion W, which is the worldview position on religion. And, secularity, as I mentioned in my last video, is often sort of imagined to be open space. But scholars for a long time have noted that secularity is not open space. There's no such thing as open space. We're all running a program. It's sort of like imagining a computer without an operating system. Well, no, you need something to operate the code. So let's dive in. Justin has just introduced the program, and we're off.
We'll start with you, Jordan. You're a hard man to categorize in many ways. Your work at...
Now, this was done in... Oh boy, I should have done a little bit of more research. It was put out in June of 2018. It was done just before it was done. The 12 Rules for Life came out in January, so it had just come after that. Jordan Peterson hadn't really started the book tour as he did before. He hadn't yet done the conversations in Vancouver, London, and Dublin with Sam Harris, and so this is pre that. And in some ways, the Jordan Peterson Sam Harris conversations really mark the peak of that wave. I think the book tour was in some ways decadent in that it was the wave was already decaying. He was doing way too many talks. He had his wife was fighting cancer. He was struggling with benzodiazepine and his own emotional stability, and of course that all came down to a collapse in June 2019. And he's really been in a medical wilderness since then. But here, I think we really see Peterson at his peak. I don't remember if it was a conversation with Justin Brierley, not in person because we've never spoken. I guess we have spoken. But he had noted that he felt fortunate to get Jordan in on his program quickly before Jordan really hit new levels in terms of attention in the broader population. So
actually attracts attention. Jordan, Susan and Jordan, welcome along to the program.
Thanks.
Great to have you.
Thank you, Justin.
We'll start with you, Jordan. You're a hard man to categorize in many ways. Your work actually attracts attention from both believers and non-believers, and many of whom say that you've actually made them reconsider their views about religion, especially many atheists that I've heard on who've said...
Now, again, religion, when Justin uses it that way, that would be religion S, the secular version of religion, where we connect it to church-going, prayer. Sam Harris's definition of religion, very much connected with God number 2, religious practice, this kind of thing. And then you very much have the modernist secular versus religion frame there. But as this conversation progresses, the question about what we mean by that word really comes to the fore.
Your work opens up things in a new way. Do you just tend to describe yourself as a religious man at all?
I would definitely describe myself as a religious man, yeah.
Now, Jordan Peterson doesn't go to church. Jordan Peterson's prayer life, depending on what he says to Sam Harris there, Jordan Peterson would not really be categorized as religious in the same way that I, as a Christian minister and a churchgoer and someone who has identified as a Christian all of my life in all the traditional ways, would be categorized by secular society as religious. But right away, Jordan is beginning to play and to redefine this word religious, okay? And so now he categorizes himself as a religious man.
Yeah.
Religious man at all?
I would definitely describe myself as a religious man, yeah. I think that's fundamentally true.
Now, again, if you look at his question about religion that he answered at Lafayette College, That's really religion W, worldview religion. Everybody has one. Everybody has the coding. It's the culture net. It's the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary that we're all participating in. So that's religion W, religion worldview versus religion, the secular definition of religion, which is more performative. And the last few videos that I've been describing, it's much more a relationship with divinity, or very God number two-ish, a divine entity or a divine being, however it's conceptualized. Secularism defines religion that way. Worldview religion is, now those of you who know much about the landscape of the Christian landscape know that, well, the Dutch Calvinists have for a long time been talking about the worldview, for a long time been talking about the myth of religious neutrality. There are books on my shelf from the 80s and 90s that talk about these issues.
The devil's in the details. So what does that mean? I think that's fundamentally true. The devil's in the details. So what does that mean exactly?
And that's where they're going to go with this conversation in many ways, because in many ways this whole conversation pivots around this definition of religion.
I've seen you being asked the question, do you believe in God? And that's not a question you necessarily find it terribly easy to answer.
Well, I don't know what people mean when they say believe. Like it's as if that question explains itself when it's asked. It's like it doesn't. What do you mean by believe? And what do you mean by God? And what makes you think that the question that I'm answering is the same one that you're asking? This is not something that you can say yes or no to in any straightforward manner. So I find it an off-putting question. And
again, religion S, or secular religion, would say, no, it's a completely easy answer, whether or not you believe in God. And religious people, along the secular definition, who are modernist, also make that sort of the key thing. And part of the reason church attendance reached its peak during the Cold War was that belief in God became a very important, definable identity marker in the culture. And I think also Jordan Peterson's treatment of this is, again, another sign of the changing of the tides in the estuary, that modernity is going away and something else is replacing it. And of course, Jordan is on that journey to figure out for himself what replaces it. And again, this is a very long story. This isn't just 10 years or 20 years or 50 years. These kinds of changes, sea changes, are marked in centuries.
And I don't think it's because I'm avoiding the issue. I think that to answer it properly requires books and lectures. So,
do you see
or videos? Lots of them.
Yourself, at least in the Christian tradition, as far as your, I suppose, worldview?
There's no doubt about that, because I'm a Westerner. There's no escape from that.
Yeah.
So basically here, he almost completely adopts Tom Holland's thesis. And this is why when I read Tom Holland, I immediately thought of Jordan. And then when I had my interview with Tom Holland, which you can find on my channel, I asked him, have you heard of Jordan Peterson? No, not really. And I thought, well, that's interesting. You're not getting it from Jordan. You're coming at this on your own. And in terms of the timing of Tom's work, again, Tom wrote that New Statesman article in 2016. So this stuff has been moving quickly.
I'm conditioned in every cell as a Westerner.
Christian tradition, as far as your, I suppose, worldview.
There's no doubt about that, because I'm a Westerner. There's no escape from that.
Yeah.
I'm conditioned in every cell as a consequence of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And so I've read a fair bit in other religious traditions and have a reasonable grasp on some of them, I would say, not trying to overestimate my knowledge. But we're saturated in Judeo-Christian ethics, and so...
I've seen you say that you certainly live your life as though God exists.
I just wanted to check the sound levels, and so far it sounds pretty good. Let's keep going.
Not trying to overestimate my knowledge, but we're saturated in Judeo-Christian ethics, and so...
I've seen you say that you certainly live your life as though God exists.
Yes, I would say, well, to the best of my ability. Right, yeah. And I think that that's the fundamental hallmark of belief, is it's how you act, not what you say about what you think you think.
Sure.
What do you know about what you think? Seriously, I mean, we wouldn't need a psychology,
Yeah.
an anthropology, a sociology, any of the humanities if our thoughts were transparent to ourselves. They're not in the least.
And you've been
And again, Peterson is he's a clinical psychologist. He knows Freud. He knows Jung. He's deeply aware that we are far more complex. What comes out of our mouth is just one element of what in the past I've called our consciousness congress. There are many other players going on. And if you go back to my conversation with Poe, her question, do you think I believe in God? This is a very astute question. And I said, probably. And that's manifest by, again, if you go back to her video of the when she was having her child and when there was some medical, she found herself praying and sort of surprised herself with this. Well, that doesn't surprise me at all. And that's how we are. We have a consciousness congress, and we are not fully in charge of all of the members in that congress.
In the least, they are. But
you've been willing to be quite critical.
an anthropology, a sociology, any of the humanities. If our thoughts were transparent to ourselves, they're not in the least.
And you've been
in the least. They
in the least they are. And again, this is classic Peterson, and I think I love watching these videos because this is where Jordan, I think, really shines before, everything that we know happened later.
They are, but
you've been willing to be quite critical as well of some of the new atheists, so Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins. What have you made of their particular way of approaching
they
religion?
just don't take it seriously enough. They're, as far as I'm concerned, they don't contend with the real thinkers.
Now, Susan Blackmore's mouth is open. She's about to launch in, and we're going to get ahead of ourselves beyond the introduction here. And of course, Peterson will talk to Sam Harris, and they will establish a personal relationship, and that would go on from there. But this point that Peterson has made again and again is, I think Peterson is saying that these thinkers don't take the observations of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky near enough about the complexity. In other words, the anthropology that these thinkers promote is facile, it's shallow, and I would argue it's really 18th century. It's much more of an 18th century project, imagination of what a human being is, and then you add Darwin on the 19th century. But it doesn't fully take into account Freud or Jung or even the cognitive science that we are seeing now, which it's important to notice that in a way, just as biology and geology took apart the Christianity of the Middle Ages, and astronomy took apart the discarded image, as C.S. Lewis calls it. The contemporary brain science is taking apart some of the facile, shallow assumptions of the new atheists and the atheism that really arose in the 18th and 19th and early 20th century.
I know all three of them very well, and I have deep, great arguments with them. And
I had no idea who Susan Blackmore was, but she's a fun guest, and part of what's fun about Justin is Justin's got as we'd say in the old days, he's got a fat Rolodex, and he knows a lot of people to bring in, and they seem to want to come on his program, and Justin does an amazing job with these shows. So Susan is a fun conversation partner for Jordan Peterson.
they seem to be taking it seriously. I know what you mean. There's a certain sort of superficiality in the writings of all of them. But as people, I find they really care about these issues.
Care.
Yeah.
Oh, they care. There's no doubt about that. And it's not like I'm not sympathetic to the atheist or rationalist claim. I'm perfectly sympathetic to it, but I don't believe that the level of discussion that's characteristic of Dawkins and Dennett and Sam Harris, say, approaches the level of complexity of, say, Friedrich Nietzsche or Dostoevsky.
Well, that would be asking quite
Carl
a lot,
Jung.
wouldn't it?
Yeah, but if you're going to play in that arena,
Yeah, okay.
man, you're going to play with the heavyweights.
But what I've noticed is it's a lot of people who maybe up to a point, have been interested in what those people have been saying from the New Atheist side, who are also interested in what you're saying. There's an interesting sort of correlation there.
Yeah, definitely.
And why is it that, especially some of these, potentially, I see a lot of men in this audience are coming to you, Jordan, to sort of sit at your feet and hear what you have to say at this point?
Well, the New Atheists have a hell of a time with an active ethic. They say, well, you can build an ethic on rationality. It's like, well, first of all, that's not self.
And again, if you go back to so many of the YouTube, talking to Ryan Bennett, who many of you out there are far more acquainted with YouTube than I am. But there was this period during New Atheism that YouTube really arose, where you had the Christian atheist debates on YouTube. And they almost always follow the same pattern. And they tended to get a little monotonous. It was, again, the divine super thing. Is it or isn't it? Can we have access to it? Or it's the, what are your morals grounded in? And I think what's so devastating about Tom Holland's work is that he says you just basically take Christian morals, you just assume it, and you smuggle it in via humanism. And most of us would say, well, thank God you're doing it. We really appreciate that. But the imagination that you jumped from the Greeks to the Enlightenment to modern new atheism, and somehow keep that in a clean room, untouched by the hands of Jesus or other, against secular religious definition, religious people, and that you can somehow just arrive at this rationally, you've never been able to do it, because the more you poke at it, and what we're seeing now is that as it recedes into the background, Ross Douthat made the same point when he had that conversation with Tara Isabel Burton and Stephen Smith, that in some ways communism and Nazism were continued progressions of certain strains of Western thought, and the Western powers sort of pulled back, and again the flourishing of the mainline churches and of religious observance during the Cold War was, I think, partly a response to Nazism and to communism that said, oh no, when it comes to morality, we're going to believe the Bible. But again, mainline and many other elements said, well, we'll get our morality from the Bible, but we'll get our science we'll get our age of the earth, evolution, human origin, medicine, geology. We'll get all that from science, but we'll get our morality from the Bible. And if you listen to things in the 50s and 60s, until really the counterculture comes in, that's very much the case. Now, again, in my conversation with Tom Holland, one of the things that we talked about was that, he's got a couple other book projects, but the book he really wants to write is on the 60s, and I think he's right. And that's where Stephen Smith comes in. And, well, what was the 60s? What really was that turn? So what happened then after the Cold War was really resolved, and with the 9/11 attacks, was finally to say, okay, we're going to discredit and repudiate Christianity completely. We are no longer, we find the morality of the Bible wanting, and so we need a new morality. But then suddenly the atheist movement fractures into sort of the classical liberals, James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Brett Weinstein, and then the new, what Jordan Peterson would call the postmodernists, or the Marxists, which they get called, or let's just use the woke, and where now suddenly it's these categorical essentialisms of race and gender and a certain, for a group that wants to avoid meta-narratives, a certain storytelling about the past, which sees through the lens of oppression and oppressor, that fractures the atheist coalition that stood against the secular the religious, as defined by the secular religion, and I mean that's basically then the story of the late 20th century and the beginning of the 21st.
evident. It's possible, but it's by no means self-evident. Rational time with an active ethic. They say,
Jordan, to sort of sit at your feet and hear what you have to say at this point.
Well, the new atheists have a hell of a time with an active ethic. They say, well, you can build an ethic on rationality. It's like, well, first of all, that's not self-evident. It's possible, but it's by no means self-evident. And their essential existential concept is rather hollow. Like with Harris, for example, when I talked to him twice on 2 different podcasts, and we never really got to his sense of what the ideal society might be. But I've read his writing.
And so what he says, okay, Sam, you have this idea of well-being, map out the eschaton. And he struggles with that. Well, partly because, well, in some ways it's going to look creepily like Revelation with every tongue and creed, but it's not going to look like Revelation, where the people of the earth call on the mountains to fall upon them to save them from the one who is on the throne and the Lamb and the face of the Lamb. So that's the difficulty that many are having, in that they're struggling to come up with an eschaton. And so if you watch shows like The Good Place or Amazon's Upload, you can watch that struggle with the eschaton. And so basically where those shows go is where, now spoiler alert on The Good Place, where The Good Place ends, which is nothing. So it's annihilationism. Now again, all of these options have been out there in religious communities for a very long time, but that's where it goes. Well, the difficulty that you have is, well, if your life isn't living up to your expectations or your dreams, or it's full of suffering, why not kill yourself? Because that's your eschaton, right?
Writings on the maximization of well-being, for example, and that's just not going anywhere. You can't even measure it properly. And if you're thinking about something,
now again, Peterson's work has been in Big Five personality, measuring these things. And so one of the things that he was doing before all this stuff happened to him was measuring, conservatives and liberals and openness and all the stuff that's in his lectures. Again, similar stuff to what Jonathan Haidt was doing. He was working on that. And he just looks at Sam Harris's work and say, are you going to be rationalistic or scientific? You can't even measure these things. And so that's weak sauce.
Something like that scientifically, that turns out to be that's not a problem. It's a catastrophic problem.
But Sam really goes deeply into the consequences of meditation, and he tells...
Okay, now it's interesting because she turns the conversation over to meditation. Now, 50 years ago, meditation by secularists would have been described as a religious practice. And so now, in a sense, what you've got are people who want to very much identify as secular, or they're sort of rummaging through the old boxes of what they call the religious to take things out and say, well, let's take this and let's use this. But, well, where then is the line for the religious? Well, we won't imagine that there's a divine super thing up there. And we won't imagine we're relating to the divine super thing. So we're going to strip everything off it and practice the performity purely as performity within and Charles Taylor gets into this, within a buffered self, okay? And we'll go there. Now I'm going to pause this. I'm at 5:56, probably a little before, because I'm going to have a conversation with John Van Donk now. I wanted to see if I could do a little bit of this. I'm a little worried about breaking up these kind of videos, but I just haven't had time lately in my life to have a full hour or two to make videos. So hopefully I'll come back to it and this will see the light of day. Okay, Susan Blackmore's about to jump in here, and we've been looking at religion as, if you look at Vervaeke's 4 Ps, propositional, religion as a set of beliefs, perspectival, participatory, procedural as a set of practices, and so that's religion S, which is sort of religion, the secular perspective of religion, or the secular definition of religion: church-going, prayer, giving, having a relationship, a personal relationship with God or Jesus, or see, again, once you change the language, you'd say, I have a personal relationship with the universe, and suddenly people say, well, that's spiritual but not religious. Oh, okay. And so what she's going to say is that, well, Well, what do you mean? Because we've been rummaging around in the religious storehouses, and we pulled out things and we sort of purified them from religion. We sort of put them into a buffered state. Again, if you read Charles Taylor, the buffered self. And so what comes out of meditation is only what's in my mind. And again, in terms of religion worldview, well, there's the buffered self. There's sort of materialist conception, and I can prime what happens in my experience and my emotions and my sense of wonder and all these things. I can do all that by going through practices, but as long as I keep sort of within the iron box of secularism, where I keep it sort of shut in there, then it's okay and it's safe and it can be public. But once it's religious, again, in the secular definition of religious, then it's different. So that's the point she's going to make.
Sam really goes deeply into the consequences of meditation, and he tells stories about his own experience of how behavior changes. Compassion seems to arise naturally. This is not...
Okay, now compassion, though, there's a value. Well, why is compassion better than just a dismissive attitude that people who are on the wrong side of history or enemies of the state or whatnot get what they deserve? And see, that's where all of this stuff gets really complicated.
Not based on rationality, which is not everything, and I would agree with you there.
Based on rationality? What do you mean? Well, so let's say I want to experience compassion, therefore I can engage in these practices to create within me compassion. Well, I guess that would be a rational argument for it. But what is your rational argument that compassion? Well, but it's going to have to be, well, compassion in these cases and not in those cases, which, again, rationality is almost always a means of achieving a particular outcome. But it's the goodness of the outcome that really gets difficult.
It's based on practical experience, training in observing one's own thoughts, which is also of interest.
And she would say practical experience training, as opposed to, say, divine revelation, because, of course, Sam Harris gets really, God talking to me. Again, God as a super thing. Now, Jordan Peterson's revelation is a very different thing. It's much more Darwinian from below. But so for Sam Harris, the super thing telling you to pray in order to find favor with the super thing, for the super thing to give you what you want in your life, that's religious. But to do practices that formerly were described as religious in order to achieve certain values in my life, but then again, you still have the problem. Have you just simply inherited all these old Christian values, and now you, by virtue of your science and your brain science, have found certain things that you believe lead to the effect of the value that you basically just smuggled in from Jesus?
Interest to you, and in the way behavior changes in ways which he would say, and also query whether it's true, that it's better behavior.
Well,
that being compassionate and kind to people is better. We can't have some great...
Unless they're a Nazi, then you punch them, because that's the way this goes. People are like, well, we should be compassionate to all people, but what about those people over there that are have agendas that you disagree with and you think are hateful, or for one reason or another are morally beneath you? Are you going to have compassion on them? No, they need to be imprisoned or ostracized or even worse, because we can't let them be in power. Well, the compassionate thing for the presidential election would be let both of them win. Well, Sam Harris isn't going to, say, okay, let Trump win because out of compassion, we're going to let Donald Trump serve 8 years because he would feel bad if he only served 4. That suddenly compassion's out the window. No, now we're okay. But it's that seriousness is where the game is really played.
Underlying reason why, if you don't have God, it's a very difficult question. You've got to find some basis. But even without one, Sam is trying to say, as I would, that if you spend a lot of time meditating and really becoming to understand yourself and see the consequences of certain thoughts and actions, then better actions follow.
Depending, again, on meditation. Maybe I'm going to meditate on the shortcomings of my enemies, and I'm going to, well, they say, no, that's the negative medication. You clear your mind. Well, you clear your mind in order to see the shortcomings of your enemies and in order to plan their demise. I mean, that's the point. The stuff can be taken in different direction, because you would say compassion is generally a good thing, unless compassion towards someone that you think because of other reasons you shouldn't be compassionate towards.
That's one of the things I like about his work.
Well, and I'm certainly not questioning his ethical integrity or his commitment to these problems, although I certainly don't think that compassion or kindness constitutes a sufficient grounds for a transcendent ethic. Not in the least. Partly because both, and I can speak about that technically to some degree. Compassion is associated with trait agreeableness fundamentally, and agreeableness is a great short-term strategy for infants. But it's a very bad medium to long-term strategy for adults, and it's by no means the ground upon which an entire complex society can rest. And that's partly what you see playing out right now in the political world, because the politically correct types are very high in compassion. We have research that demonstrates that. But that ethic doesn't work for a sophisticated society.
We were only doing introductions. We're already well into the...
It's my fault. I started. I interrupted.
But let's...
This was a delightful conversation, and everybody's got a good spirit about them, and they're going to talk about issues seriously, and they're going to have differences, and so I appreciate Susan Blackmore's the spirit with which she enters this conversation. I think it's delightful, and again, Justin just does a terrific job with this.
Come to you, Sue. You may be familiar to some unbelievable listeners who have already heard you on the show before. I think you're happy to describe yourself as an atheist. Does that mean for you that you are a naturalist, someone who's committed to a view that our experiences can be fully explained by a purely material world?
No, I mean, I sign up in a way to naturalism groups and beliefs, but because I work on consciousness such a lot, and the problem of how do we relate, the mind-body problem, here's this table, here's my glass of water, we'll agree that if I go like this, it'll go all over the place.
And ruin the microphone.
How does that relate to the taste of the water? These fundamental problems mean I have big queries about naturalism as you described it there.
Okay.
In a much broader sense, yes. As you know, and many listeners will know, I started out being a parapsychologist and rejected ideas of clairvoyance and telepathy and ghosts.
And now that's interesting. I don't know anything about her background, but she rejected these ideas. And now that's kind of says, well, let's keep things in certain realms, okay? And we don't want super things out there that are non-physical entities and this kind of thing.
Poltergeist, because of lack of evidence. So that's one way to naturalism, to throw that lot out. I was brought up like you as a Christian, and I threw that out because in the end it didn't make sense to me. So that's another way to say I'm left with naturalism, but I'm not left with a naturalism that explains everything. I'm left with a feeling that that's what I want to try to do, to understand what's going on here in minds, in bodies, in tables and glasses.
So it's a fairly scientific approach, and I think that's legitimate, because if you're just always explaining everything with the God answer, God smuggling. I just had a conversation with John Van Donk when we talked a little bit about Jesus smuggling, and how the real problem with Jesus smuggling isn't that Jesus shows up in a conversation. It's that Jesus is the pat answer to every question. And obviously with science, the whole purpose of science is you're trying to explore and look for mechanisms and causal mechanisms beneath, and you're trying to eliminate variables and try and find causal relationships. That's the whole goal of science. And I think that's a very legitimate effort. And the effort came out of Christians trying to do this. In a sense, they were trying to explore God. But now use of the word God in that sentence no longer makes sense to people, because that's really God number one instead of, Sam Harris's God number two.
Of water, and it's very difficult.
You're well known for picking up the idea of memes that sort of originated at some level with Richard Dawkins, the idea of an idea propagated across generations. And you even went as far as to describe religion as a virus of the mind in terms of its
that was Richard's term, but yes, okay.
Is that a kind of view you would still stand by today?
Yes, but you've got to be careful about what you mean by a virus. I mean, I think if I often say in lectures, imagine a continuum between what you mean as being a virus of the mind, it's really bad. It's like the flu virus or
usually
AIDS
we
or
think
something.
of a virus in
Usually
negative
we do.
terms.
And, yes, and they aren't always. So imagine that you think, religions is utterly bad, or you think religion's utterly wonderful and utterly good, and all in between. I think Richard is way down there, and I'm somewhere here. I think by and large, on balance, the world would be a better place without any religions. But
Okay, what definition of religion is she using right there? It's religion S, secular religion. The world is a better place if people aren't trying to relate to this super thing, if they're not imagining that their prayer or they're going to church or they're any of these things, that they place any hope in any of them. That's basically what she's saying. Not as far as Dawkins, but that she's at that end of the conversation.
religions would not thrive if they didn't have within them things which are positive. I mean, we know at a personal level, at a society level, the worst societies are more religious. At a personal level, there's evidence that people are happier and they have better social connections and so on if they're religious. So,
okay, right there. So there she makes the assertion that, okay, in terms of communities and societies, we know that. Well, do you know? Really? Where's the evidence of this? Well, and again, when you're using religious societies, okay, what definition of religion are you using when you're using that word to describe a society? And doing that math gets very difficult very quickly. For example, maybe you'll look at participation at religious services. Say, okay, but now you've said participation at religious services as opposed to, let's say, participation at a movie theater. I would argue that there's plenty of religion in movies, even religion S, but it's certainly religion W, religion as worldview. Movies are one of the main conveyors of it. You look at a religious bookstore because they talk about God. And again, there's your religion S versus your religion W. And she's using that nomenclature in this way.
I don't think we would be stuck with these horrible memes if it weren't for the fact that they also have some good qualities.
What do you make of the whole meme theory and the fact that Sue does feel ultimately...
I think it's a shallow derivation of the idea of archetype, and that Dawkins would do well to read some Jung. In fact, if he thought farther and wasn't as blinded by his a priori stance about religion, he would have found that the deeper explanation of meme is in fact archetype.
I disagree. I mean,
Can you just first of all explain archetype for those who are not perhaps familiar with that particular psychological
Well, an archetype
term?
is partly a pattern of behavior that's grounded in biology. So it's the behavior itself. So you could think about that as both the instinct and the manifestation of that instinct, but it's also the representation of that pattern.
And this is a really excellent treatment of what is an archetype. It's both the instinct but it's also the representation of that pattern. And that's a really helpful differentiation and gives a broad, it's one of the better definitions of archetype that I've heard, at least again from his perspective.
So part of what's coded in our mythological stories, for example, are images of typical patterns of behavior. And those are the typical patterns of behavior that make us human. I really want to have this discussion about memes, by the way, because it's really a discussion that needs to be had. Because I think that the meme idea is very interesting, and I do think that there are contagious ideas. But that needs to be chased down much deeper, because there are ideas that are so contagious that we've actually adapted to them biologically. And once that happens, they're not...
Right there. They're, that key movement, that's the same movement. Brett doesn't go into that. I haven't heard him go into that as much, but the David Sloan Wilson movement and that move that Jordan Peterson made right there, that these archetypes get into the biological heredity over periods of time. They do that in terms of mate selection. They do that. I mean, part of the reason, again, part of why I got so interested in Jordan Peterson was to sort of have this worldview, this modernistic scientific worldview over here that members of my church are living in. And then I've got this Bible over here. And it's like, well, what's the connection between them? And I always saw Jordan Peterson making a connection, but where is that connection made? Right there, as a scientist, that's where Jordan sees this connection being made. That these archetypes are not only the patterns of behavior. This is why I talk about symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary. It's that dramatic, liturgical, because the dramatic is the things that we act out. The liturgical is the meaning aspect of the things that we act out. But it's in the imaginary, it's in the culture net. It's in that layer. It's not physical, but it gets into the physical layer with this development. And I think the way Jordan brings that in here, and again, you have to give credit to Jung and in terms of how Jordan connects those worlds.
We've down very interesting, and I do think that there are contagious ideas, but that needs to be chased down much deeper, because there are ideas that are so contagious that we've actually adapted to them biologically. And once that happens, they're no longer merely memes. They're something else. They're built into us. I can give you
these archetypes, as you described.
Yeah, well, I can give you a kind of example of that. So imagine, I'll have to try to do this relatively rapidly. It's very complicated, so I'm hoping I can do it. So imagine that we live in dominance hierarchies. We don't have to imagine that. That happens to be the...
And again, dominance, as later Peterson will kind of shrink back. Let's talk about status hierarchies, because it's not just status leads to dominance in many subtle ways. So status hierarchies.
The case, they're at least 350 million years old. So they're really, really old. So the idea of the archetype of dominance is older than our ability to perceive trees, right? It's really down there. And our nervous system is fully adapted to the existence of dominance hierarchies. It's one of the things the serotonergic system tracks.
We're extremely aware of status, and we hate it, and we love it, and we play to it, and we avoid it, and we try to climb up those status hierarchies. We're always, and Peterson is dead on right here, that we're always sensitive to status. And it's right there in this conversation. It's within every conversation, and it's down deep in us, and obviously then gets manifest in expressions and all over the society.
Okay, so now we also know that your position in a dominance hierarchy, especially if you're male, is proportionate to your reproductive success. The higher you up in the hierarchy, the more likely you are to...
And the thing, again, when you listen to talk about hierarchies, there are many hierarchies for human beings, okay? And that's one of the things that we're so different from the animal kingdom, because, and again, all of this is a virtue of the culture net. It's not just strength or ability to resist disease or a long life or some of these things. There's all of these status things going on all the time, and actually intuitively we're tracking many of them if we're within the cultural conversation. And so this is what we're dealing with all the time. And this, of course, as Peterson gets in, we'll get into the mating patterns and who reproduces with whom and what qualities they have, so on and so forth.
Succeed. Okay, so now we also know that your position in a dominance hierarchy, especially if you're male, is proportionate to your reproductive success. The higher you up in the hierarchy, the more likely you are to succeed. Okay, so what that means is that males have been selected for their ability to move up a dominance hierarchy. But that's not quite right. They've been selected for their ability to move up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies. And that's a very...
That's right, because all of these status hierarchies, they all come together in hierarchies too.
Very abstract set. And there's a set of characteristics that go along with the ability to move up the set of all possible dominance hierarchies that's represented in religious terms as the optimal ethical manner in which to conduct yourself.
Okay, so here's where ethics comes into, because ethics is, again, deeply connected with, we call it relevance realization in Vervaekian terms, but ethics is, okay, what are we always rewarding and discouraging or even punishing amongst those we love and those we hate? And I mean, this just all boils right into it. And again, in terms of our left brain, in terms of our right brain, the intuitive side of us, we're mapping this stuff all the time. Now, the other side of the brain, well, can I distill it into rules and ideas and get it out into propositions? Yeah, to a degree, but there's way more than I can. And so that's why you've got mapped territory and unmapped territory, and you're always working through these two things. And it's all the Peterson stuff that I talked about a couple of years ago. And it's why, he's so fruitful to listen to because he's got all this stuff down. Not only does he have it down, he's got ways of talking about it that are clear and memorable. They're memeified, and this is what all those years of education and teaching really offered him.
I see.
And that's not a meme that's casually passed from person to person. It's way deeper than that.
I think you're being unfair to memes.
Well, it's basically the sets of memes and memes that have been integrated into other archetypes and narratives and stories and structures far beyond themselves.
I would make this response here about the difference between memes and archetypes. So archetypes are there whether we have memes or not. All of that history of evolution is there.
Yes.
So we have, ideas about sex differences or ideas about dominance is a very good example that don't require memes. They can then become memes. And a meme by definition, as Dawkins started it out, is that which is imitated or that which is...
Okay, and so the meme then sort of becomes the genetics of the culture net, of the religion/worldview, of the symbolic-dramatic-liturgical-imaginary that's around us. And it's imitated because we see each other. But now the memes are playing within these hierarchies, within these spaces, because we see someone do something and we know they get a status upgrade. They level up. We say, oh, so I'm going to imitate that so I can level up too. And so the memes are like these tiny little things that are part of the far bigger, and they get... And, okay, I saw someone do something, they leveled up, I'm going to do it, so I level up. And so other people see me do it, so they all level up. And then, well, now everybody's leveled up, and so someone's going to do something different, and boom, they leveled up. Well, what did they do differently? I mean, fashion works this way. Someone comes to school dressed in a different way, and everybody looks at them, and everybody's just trying to decide, is that better or worse? And some people will say, well, that's kind of worse. And more people will say better. And the cool people say that's better. And boom, they leveled up. Suddenly everybody starts dressing that way. And this is what human beings do.
Which is copied from person to person. So the idea of dominance hierarchies can be a meme. And all the ideas we build on top of that, as long as we pass it from...
After Jordan Peterson, the idea of dominance hierarchies definitely became a meme. But again, pay attention. The memes are very small things. But they're playing within these dominance hierarchies.
Person to person. Now,
we could certainly think of hierarchies of memes from
yes, indeed,
from ones that are no more than fads that wash across the culture to ones that are permanent. But you were kind of
trivializing memes, and I think the power of the idea of memes is this: we have the first replicator, genes on the planet, and we know the consequences of that, producing all these organisms. But the idea about memes is that they are a second replicator. So genes are copied by chemical processes.
Now, they're a second replicator, but they are dependent upon a level of capacity. And this is where a lot of these evolutionary conversations get very interesting because, eyesight and intelligent design. I mean, how do you develop into eyesight? Because you need a level of capacity before creatures are capable of engaging in the meme network. Okay? So that has to be there too. So how do they get to that level?
In bodies. Memes are copied by imitation and other kinds of interactions between human beings, and very little in any other species at all. And that's what gives rise to culture. So the whole theory about memes is one of many ways of trying to understand the evolution of culture. And in that way, I say it's not trivial
quick
at all.
Response, and I want to move on to talking about the 12 rules, Jordan.
Well,
That's a shame because they really did need to have this meme conversation, and it's a really good conversation.
The issue is what happens when a meme is so widely distributed that it becomes a determining factor in evolution itself. Because it translates...
meme gene co-interaction.
Yes, exactly. Well, see, that's where I think the religious... For me, that's the grounds of the essential religious instinct.
Okay. Religion W. Okay. And religion S.
It's a meme gene interaction, and it goes back forever.
Yes.
And then I'll finish with this. See, because once you see that there's a meme gene interaction and that there's selection in favor of a certain meme, let's say, then...
Or the capacity to engage in that meme. Okay? Let's say a meme is NBA stardom. All right? Well, NBA players mate with who? WNBA players? Probably not a lot. Probably, well, really good-looking women. And their children, well, the NBA players can afford private lessons and helicopter rides and on and on and on and on and on. So suddenly you're producing NBA players. Kobe Bryant, his father was an NBA player. LeBron James' kids, they'll probably play in the NBA.
Then you open up the entire question of what constitutes the underlying reality. Because, you see, one, this is something I
because the underlying reality, well, it's the reality of the memes, okay? It's the culture net. It's the symbolic-dramatic-liturgical-imaginary. It's that layer, and you don't have a human being without that layer.
I tried to have a talk with about Sam Harris, and we augured in very rapidly. You could say that reality is that which selects. Now, it's not exactly a materialist viewpoint. It's more of an evolutionary viewpoint. And if reality is that which selects, then what's selected by that reality is in some sense correct.
Okay, reality is that which selects. That's a good definition. Reality is that which selects. Well, selecting, what is selecting? Is selecting the product of consciousness? That's certainly one way we use the word. Is selecting the product of rules that are set up in a system that is emerging? Well, we have those kinds of things too. Reality is that which is selects, and that which is correct is what is selected. And there you have Jordan Peterson's Darwinian truth. Now, that truth isn't... What's helpful is to understand when we use this word truth, the different conceptions that we're using it in. And so in a sense, Jordan is saying, well, that's one definition of truth. That's his Darwinian truth.
Now, that's not, well, this is why
yeah, you're adding on that's a big claim you're adding on.
I know it's a big claim.
But again, what this is doing is we're inching past sort of this modernist correspondence of truth where you're counting things. Got thing here and thing there. That's truth between the things. There's 5 pennies in my pocket. Those are things. Now, there's other elements of true, such as, and Peterson makes this out, was his aim true? Well, there's sort of correspondence between the end of the tip of the arrow and the bullseye and the target. Or is your spouse true? Well, does that mean talk about sexual intercourse? Does that talk about, does she have your best interests at heart? Which best interests of heart? When you use true in that sense, you're very quickly into the meme verse, because you're very into the culture verse, because there's a whole list of hierarchies that you're dealing with, and maybe your spouse is sexually promiscuous and she sleeps around with everyone, but the kind of truth that you value is over here. When it comes right down to it, he always brings the money home and pays all the bills. And that's the true that you care about, and he can go and have as many affairs as he wants. Which is relevant to the context. So we're sort of taking Vervaeke and Peterson and putting them together here.
I understand it's a big claim, but it's also the central claim of pragmatism.
Let's move it on just a bit, because this is all fascinating stuff.
Yes.
I do want to talk about the book, which I read, found really interesting, Jordan. 12 Rules for Life. Very much drawing, actually.
And I was going to end the commentary here because it was so good, but then I listened to more of it, thought, no, this is all good too.
On your biblical series as well. And that was interesting to me. It's almost like, I don't know, psychological theology or something like that. I'm not sure what term to give it, but you constantly draw throughout it. It's a rule book for helping people to lead meaningful lives, very practical in that sense, but stacked with illustrations and stories from biblical stories, Adam and Eve, the flood, Cain and Abel, and so on, and Jesus as well. Why has that particularly been your focus recently, to explain life and psychology from this very religious standpoint?
Well, I wouldn't say recently. I think I've been doing this since about 1985. But the reason, there's multiple reasons. The fundamental reason is because I was trying to solve 3 problems, I would say. One would be the problem of how to live in the face of the undeniable tragedy of life. The other is what to do with the fact that malevolence exists. And those are the 2 most fundamental questions, and they're interrelated, because what happens is that the apprehension of tragedy is one of the things that drives people towards malevolence. I have a chapter in there called Don't criticize the world until you put your house in order. And I draw writings there from some of the worst people of whose actions I'm familiar with, like the Columbine High School shooters and mass murderer named Carl Panzram, who's a very insightful person. And I've tried to track how it is that people develop a malevolent attitude towards being, I would say, towards life. And that's intrinsically associated with tragedy. Well, these great stories that we have, part of the substructure of our culture, are antidotes to both malevolence and tragedy. That's what, and I mean that, I'm not necessarily even saying that they're successful antidotes, but the reason that they were formulated, the deep reason, is as a response to the tragic conditions of life and to malevolence. And then my experience in delving into these stories is that the farther I delve into them, the deeper they get, and that never ends. Just when I think I've got to the bottom of a story, like the story of Cain and Abel, which is like 12 sentences.
Now, what does he mean by the bottom of the story? That's really an interesting question, because I think from a scientific perspective, he's looking for the thing that makes the story work. Well, what do you mean work? Well, an explanation that sort of exhausts the story. And he's saying it just keeps branching out beneath, sort of like reality and knowledge. And Neil deGrasse Tyson has this quote that I'm not going to pull up right now, where he says that the incredible thing about the universe is that the more you discover, the more you realize you don't know. It sort of is reciprocally broadening in that sense.
Is long. I mean, it's so short, it's unbelievable. It has no bottom. And that's a really fascinating phenomena. I guess it's partly, like the Bible is a hyperlinked text, so that every verse refers to many other verses. And so you never get to the end of it in some sense. But then it's also hyperlinked with the entire culture around it. And then I also think that because the stories in Genesis, especially the first part of Genesis, are deeply mimetic in the sense that you've been describing, that they have a kind of biological depth that's unparalleled as well. Yes, they have a life of their own, that's for sure. A life that lasts a lot longer than the mere lives of mortals, let's say. So,
and the rules all have, quite fun titles in a way. In fact, I think they originally came from a blog post you put up on an internet website, but you've obviously developed them in all kinds of different ways. Stand up straight with your shoulders back. Rule number 2, treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. Number 3, make friends with people who want the best for you, and so on. I guess I'd be interested to know what your response, having had a chance to look at the book, is to this way of looking at life and how we create meaning for ourselves in the process.
That's fascinating.
Is my reaction, if you like. It's so full of lovely stories, really interesting, thought-provoking stories. Wisdom, lots of wisdom all over the place. Then the Bible stories. Then
the Bible stories. Religion S. Oh no, God, stuff out there. We don't have the buffered self. We don't have the mechanisms of the things that we sort of snuck out of religion and then washed them down and made them clean and free of anything supernatural. Another word that is a very recent word.
And this
you just don't understand that? You don't get why the Bible is being invoked?
I get it in this sense, that those stories, many of them, are very deep and have something to tell us. But it's the way I think that Jordan kind of slithers from a good idea.
Slithers.
About this might be a good way to live your life, to this story. I mean, let me give you an example. You talk about, with great...
Because he seems to be leveraging the authority of the Bible. Well, that's exactly the problem, Religion S. The Bible has authority, and that's what we're trying to get rid of. We don't want the Bible, we don't want that book to have authority. It can be an illustration, but it can't have authority. Well, why does it have authority for Jordan Peterson? It has authority for Jordan Peterson because of his memes and archetypes and all of this stuff built in, and because Jordan Peterson basically offered a Darwinian justification of the Bible and said these ideas and this book has been so formative in one of the most successful parts of the world that it should have authority for that reason. That's essentially his argument.
Knowledge about the evolutionary arms race between the size of babies' heads and the size of women's pelvises. And this is something that's always fascinated me. I think it's meme-driven that, we've ended up with childbirth being painful, as I well know, and you probably don't, how painful it is.
What do you mean by no? Saber, conocer. Spanish has the differentiation. We in English, we get just this one word that we say, well, I know it in a way you don't know it. If, well, she's given birth. Yeah, that's true.
For those reasons. But then later in the book, you bring in the story of Adam and Eve and how God says, women will suffer and, and so on. And the implication, not clearly stated, but the implication to the reader is God did it.
Oh, she's suspicious of the authority that he is going to reinforce certain values. Okay, but we started out this thing saying, well, where do you get this value of compassion from? Well, compassion lives in a value economy with many other values, and everybody else plays that out. She's continues to have post-religious stress disorder.
Now, on the one hand, you're saying, look, we evolved this way. This pain and suffering is an inevitable consequence of the way that evolution has played out. And in the other, you're kind of luring people into believing that God actually made that.
God, authority, religion, S. We're talking about a super thing that made things. And no, banish that story, ban that story. That's the problem. That's the post-religious stress disorder.
And even worse than that, the idea that it at least speaks to me, that somehow we're so bad and deserve all that suffering.
Oh, now she's sensitive and she's had her feelings hurt and she's got this whole idea about, well, we should say things that make people feel good. Well, unless, of course, she's, as Jordan Peterson pointed out to Kathy Newman, but you're trying to make me feel bad. So that idea that, we should only look at things that make us feel good, you're allowed to violate that rule. Why? Because there's a hierarchy of values that say, generally speaking, we should say things that make people feel good unless we have a deeper reason to make them feel bad, to try to discourage them from other things that we think are bad.
Which in other places in the book you try and get rid of, that we shouldn't feel so wicked and bad.
How do you respond to that, Jordan?
Well, you asked a little bit earlier you were talking about psychological theology, and I did this lecture series on Genesis, 15 lectures on Genesis, and it was called a psychological interpretation of the biblical stories, psychological approach to the biblical stories, I think. And I've been trying to do that. Like, I'm not a theologian, even though I'm very interested in these stories.
I don't think we're ever going to see Exodus.
And what I was trying to do I do believe that the biblical texts are foundational. I believe it in the Nietzschean sense. And, Nietzsche, of course, announced famously in the late 1800s that God was dead. And the typical rationalist atheist regards that as a triumphalist proclamation. But that wasn't that for Nietzsche. And Nietzsche knew perfectly well and said immediately afterward that the consequences of that was going to be bloody catastrophe because everything was going to fall. And he predicted the rise of communism, for example, and the deaths of tens of millions of people in the aftermath of the death of God. Because Nietzsche knew perfectly well that when you pull the cornerstone out from underneath a building, that even though it may stay aloft in midair like a cartoon character that's wandered off a cliff for some period of time, that it will inevitably crumble.
And again, these things are very slow moving. The time is clocked in decades and centuries.
And that it will be replaced by something that's perhaps far worse. Now, Nietzsche hoped it would be replaced by man's ability to recreate meaning spontaneously out of his psyche.
And again, if we're tracking sort of the parallels between Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland, again, the dominant place that Nietzsche is playing in both of them.
For example, which I think is a doomed enterprise, but he knew that in the interval it would be replaced by both nihilism and by communist totalitarianism, which is a hell of a prediction because it was done like 40 years before the events actually unfolded.
Well, so, you can see it that way, but if that is the case, why do we have evidence that the most dysfunctional societies today are the most religious?
Okay, so first we have a value, dysfunction, and then we have this religion S of religion. So we have this behavior over here, praying and singing and church going and those kinds of things, religion S, and then we have our other values of dysfunction. And again, she doesn't say, well, what exactly are these dysfunctions that you're pointing to? And now this time Peterson's going to engage in this a little bit.
And for example, in the United States of America, if you go across different states, the higher belief in God is proclaimed belief in God, whatever you think that means. The more murders, suicide, marital breakdown, various measures of dysfunctional society are.
And I would love to see her demonstrate this evidence because, first of all, okay, that's a pretty good list of dysfunctions, but California is about as blue a state as any. Income inequality in California is enormous. Homelessness, enormous. And for the most part, what communities are serving the homeless? Well, it's the church. And you'd have to ask yourself if the rates of religion, how in fact might be rates of religion behaviors are to these. Are they causes of them? Or are they effects from them? Is it the fact that suffering people get more religious? Yeah, usually. She wants to set up a very simplistic cause and effect relationship, and people just don't work that way. And Marianne Williamson. Is Marianne Williamson religious? Is Donald Trump religious? Is Joe Biden religious? Joe Biden is a Roman Catholic. Donald Trump, has some prosperity preacher friend. Not a big churchgoer. It just this kind of facile relationship. You just have to look at it far more deeply.
Well, it depends on how you define religion in part. I mean, first of all, America is a very religious country.
And again, now when he uses religious there, religion S.
To think of it as a country that's doing worse than other countries in the world is just not the case.
Well, its incarceration rate is higher than any other.
Well, true, but so is its standard
society
of living and its what would you say, ability to provide the basic essentials of life for people and the essential freedoms that go along with that. You wouldn't compare that to an African dictatorship.
No. But most of these studies have been done only in developed societies. But there, if you look at income inequality, that's much worse in the States. So yes, a lot of people in the States have a very high standard of living, but the poorest are really poor.
And I would argue that the places in America with the highest levels of income inequality tend to be New York, California, people that are reliably irreligious states.
Yes, well, income inequality.
With Obamacare being dismantled and so on.
Well,
but nevertheless, let me go back to that point. We know that more dysfunctional societies have higher proclaimed belief, higher attendance in church, and so on.
Okay, religion S. You just basically put it right there.
Now, this doesn't fit with what you were saying. Now, Nietzsche's ideas are very profound and interesting, but I just want to stop you from saying that he was absolutely...
I want to stop you from saying that. Well, first of all, we know that. I don't think we know that.
Right about somehow if we get rid of God, we're going to be worse.
Okay, now what is God there? God is this super thing. If we stop imagining in the super thing and putting our hopes that the super thing is going to save us, that again is the idea of God that's functioning in this conversation, at least on her side. Jordan Peterson's idea of God, when you go to Sam Harris, he'll lay it out.
Because we have very well-functioning societies.
Well, we were
Scandinavia,
pretty bad in the 20th century.
Oh, we were, yes. People were.
And we could easily drift that way again.
And there've been terrible bad things done in the name of God, and there've been terrible bad things done in the name of communism and atheism. I don't think we can. I don't want to weigh them up.
I'll weigh them up.
You'll weigh them up and you'll say...
No problem.
But then you have to go against this evidence that I've just stated.
Jordan, come...
I don't think you stated evidence. I think you stated an assertion.
Back on this evidence. I mean, obviously, from her perspective, Sue feels like actually we've got pretty stable societies that are increasingly secular these days. So perhaps Nietzsche was wrong, and in fact, we're not going to see this moral
Well, I would say
decay.
they're stable to the degree that they're actually not secular. And this is also a Nietzschean observation. And
okay, now the question of secular is in.
A Dostoevskian observation, for that matter, is that we're living on the corpse of our ancestors, like we always have. That's a very old idea, but that stops being nourishing and starts to become rotten unless you replenish it. And I don't think we are replenishing it. We're in danger of we're living on borrowed time. And
now that's a powerful metaphor, but what exactly is the corpse? The corpse is the symbolic-dramatic-liturgical-imaginary. That's the corpse. That's the system that we're using. That's the system that has neighbors behave themselves and be kind to one another and all of this stuff up there. That's what we're living on, the thing that has people be good fathers and good mothers and good neighbors and good citizens, and not only morality but generous and all of these things.
In danger of running out of it. I think that the reason that the Western societies essentially work quite well is because they act out a Judeo-Christian ethic, and one that's essentially predicated on utmost regard for the sovereignty of the individuals.
Okay, so basically his argument about the Bible comes right there, that the Bible creates this ethic and society around the Bible creates this ethic. Now again, Jordan Peterson doesn't go to church. So what religion is he talking about? And that's where Tom Holland came in and said, this is the religion you're talking about. This is the historical manifestation that this thing came about. Now, unlike the anxiety that you'll hear in Douglas Murray and Tom Holland, Jordan Peterson just doesn't really have a lot of hope that the church is doing much of anything. And many of Jordan Peterson's people don't have a lot of hope that the church is doing much of anything. But that's pretty much where he's squaring this.
So the individual is sovereign in relationship to the state, which is a remarkable idea and one that's fundamentally religious in its essence, in my mode of thinking, and that's also predicated on honest speech. And there's other predicates as well, but those are religious predicates in my estimation.
Okay, those are religious predicates again. So it's not religion-s, going to church and those things. Jordan Peterson is talking about that as religious, and it's that sense that Jordan Peterson is a religious man.
Actually, Sue, in Jordan's book, where he says this: Christianity elevated the individual soul, placing slave and master, commoner and nobleman alike on the same metaphysical footing, rendering them equal before God and the law. It's nothing short of a miracle. He has a very high view of what Christianity has done for the world.
And again, Tom Holland, basically the same point.
Whether or not it's objectively true,
Yes,
what do you take?
And again, objectively true. Well, what do we mean by that phrase? Well, there's a super thing that we can go out and lay our hands on. In what way does the culture net, does the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary, does objectively true relate to that realm? And I'm not going to say it doesn't, but it is not the same as the world of objects where you go out and you can count exactly, I have 5 coins in my pocket.
From it.
Well, that evidence that I was discussing earlier, that there's
It was an assertion.
plenty of now, that the most dysfunctional societies are also the most believing societies. There are lots.
That's what's woozling if you say it enough and you just keep coming around to it. Oh, this is the evidence. This is a finding of fact. Well, okay.
Of hypotheses about why that is the case. But I would like to challenge Jordan on the implication that he put before, that because a lot of these of our moral stance today comes from religion, and not all of it does, that it has to have that as a basis. I don't think.
But again, okay, which religion? Is that religion S, religion W? The morality is living in this realm. It's not living in my cell phone stand. Cell phone stand got entangled. Poor cell phone stand.
I think it does. I feel very grateful to live in a country where now, at last, the majority are not religious. It's just tipped over in the latest polls. And in fact, coming up.
Okay, and what does she mean by that? At last, the people aren't going to church services, and are they reading horoscopes? Is that religious? Do they believe that human history has a destiny, or human history has an arc? Because I would argue the arc of history, that's a religious statement, religious W. They might say, well, there's no divine. Well, but if you look at the video, Thoreau's argument, well, somehow we together are reaching towards this eschaton. And that's exactly Jordan Peterson's comment about Sam Harris. And in fact, my comment about The Good Place or Upload. You struggle to feel what that eschaton is. And again, that's a point that G.K. Chesterton made in terms of all of this is about negation. Well, we're negating. So there'd be a place where there's no more suffering. Okay. Well, once there isn't suffering, is there meaning? Because lack of suffering, there's lots of lacks of suffering. I'm currently lacking the suffering of having a hand amputated. And again, if you look at another one of Jordan Peterson's things, you can always make things worse. Making things better, that's a lot more difficult. It's a lot more difficult to imagine and to actually go there.
On the train from Devon today, I got chatting with various people. The assumption that I find here, I don't know what it's like in Canada, is I always start with assuming someone's an atheist, and it nearly always turns out to be there. Oh, yeah.
Well, that's interesting. Oh, Peterson's going to jump on that.
Oh, that religion stuff, It's very, very common in this country. Now, we have not descended into being a terrible...
And this gets into acting like basically this... practical atheism. Well, I'm not going to presuppose the small s religious beliefs of someone. Secularism seems to provide a platform by which it's religion free, but it isn't religion free in terms of religion W, because there's all these other beliefs, and that's exactly what we've had with the schism in the Church of Atheism with respect to woke. Are they classical liberal atheists, or are they woke atheists? Because suddenly there's a morality that has come into being that has all of these assertions that the classical woke atheists are saying, no, that isn't there. And then the other atheists are saying, no, this must be there. So what happened to the religious neutrality that we supposed to be, just because you don't have just because you're not arguing whether or not there's a super thing up there doesn't mean it isn't religious. Religion W.
Country, we have, yes, we have our problems.
We're still fairly early on in the experiment, I suppose, of ditching God.
Like about 10 years.
Yes, I will await with interest and hope I live long enough to see. But then if we look at many of the Scandinavian countries, which are way ahead of us in that move.
And this move to the Scandinavian countries is always very interesting, and the whole woke business gets even more interesting with respect to that, because the Scandinavian companies are about as white can be. Now, I'm not saying that they're racist. I'm just saying they're relatively small. Their populations are relatively homogeneous. They're certainly not anything like California. And they have great commonalities in terms of their past. So it means what? They don't argue with each other. They don't have to. Well, now take everybody from all around the world and other places, and they have all of these assumptions that are built up. Now you're getting into religion W, religion worldview, because all of these assumptions make up this culture net by which we have to figure out what is right and what is wrong. Again, I've been reading Will Durant on the 18th century, and one of the interesting things about the 18th century was that adultery was simply expected of many people. Now you might say, oh, the double standard. Oh, but that's today in America, that's one of the remaining social stigmas in not supposed to cheat. Oh, okay. Well, in the 18th century, cheating was fine. There are many other elements of that, but that's just the point, that this myth of religious neutrality. Well, I go into the train and I can talk to everyone. Yeah, because you're just like them. In all of the ways that you can't see, because it's simply assumed. It's the water that you're swimming in. All right. That's the point about religion S versus religion W.
They have wonderful health systems, welfare state, support for...
What about Singapore? Singapore has wonderful health systems, wonderful welfare state. Doesn't Singapore? Singapore, you might get caned.
For people out of work and so on.
I'd be really interested in hearing your response to all this then, Jordan. Ultimately, we can divorce the good principles that we may have had in some respects from religion ultimately, and still leave...
Yes.
Okay, and Justin basically is religion S, because that's what we're talking about.
Perfectly happy secular
it depends.
lives.
See, a lot of this depends on your definition of religion.
Right there. A lot of this depends on your definition of religion. Is it religion S or religion W?
No.
Yes.
Perfectly happy secular
it depends.
lives.
See, a lot of this depends on your definition of religion. I know perfectly well from my own empirical studies that there's at least two disparate sets of phenomena that might be regarded as religious, right? There's the dogmatic element, which is really what Sue's referring to when she talks about the pathology of religious belief.
I'm not sure it's necessarily the dogmatic element, because again, it's the degree to which religious S people leverage the ideas and morals and norms that they ascribe to their Bible. And trust me, as a religious person and working with religious people all the time, you find a huge variation, 18th century France versus 21st century America, both looking at the same Bible. You have a huge variation in terms of what you imagine is prescribed and prohibited by that Bible. And again, reading about the 18th century, you have these monarchs that are the head of the church, and God only, Louis XV, only God can judge him, and dissolves the parliament and all of that. But Louis XV is a constant womanizer, but believes, well, God will forgive that. And Rousseau himself grew up in Geneva, goes to, basically takes on a mistress because wives are more expensive than mistresses. I mean, it's a wholly different thing, and they're all going back to the same Bible. Now, is that an argument for relativism? No, but it is an argument that these systems are far more complex in terms of what's going on. So it's not just the dogmatic elements. Dogma is a part of it, but every culture is modulating the dogma as well.
Element, which is really what Sue's referring to when she talks about the pathology of religious belief. And there's the spiritual element, and the dogmatic element tends to appeal to people who are essentially conservative in their temperamental nature, and I mean that scientifically speaking. And the meaningful element, the spiritual element, let's say, tends to appeal to people who are more liberal in their temperamental.
And nobody defines spiritual. Okay, what do you mean by spiritual? Well, is it the movement within that imaginary, or is it the norms? Is it the degree to which memes sort of set into the culture and place themselves?
Fundamentals. And religion overall is a continual dialogue between the dogmatic element and the spiritual element. And if either of those exceeds its proper boundaries, then there's a degenerative consequence. Okay. Like if the spiritual types get the upper hand, then the structure disappears. And if the dogmatic types get the upper hand, then everything clamps down into too much stasis. So to make a direct claim, say, between the existence of dogmatic belief and the pathology of society, and then to assume that that encompasses the entire relationship between religion and the functioning of...
What he seems to do is to try to separate the propositional from the perspectival, participatory... I can never pull all those 4 P's off the top of my head all at once.
Society, I think, is based upon an unfortunate narrowing of the definition of what constitutes religious. But then back to the idea that our moral claims can be divorced from the religious substrate. It depends on what you mean, and here we go with the definition, by moral substrate, or religious substrate. Let's say that I regard you as a sovereign individual. Well, the question is, what does that mean? It might just be an opinion. It might just be a meme. It might be reflective of something far deeper. So deep that if we transgress against it, it will be fatal.
So deep between them. She goes on the train and suddenly, well, there's this whole strata beneath them of all agreement. What the irony that she's talking about is not diversity, but conformity. Conformity to a particular religion W worldview, and in that conformity she simply flows freely. Now there might be people of different skin color, there might be people of different sexual orientation, all of the certain elements of diversity she's looking like, but beneath there's all this agreement as to what in fact they believe and how they see the world and what the rules are that are creating that conformity around them. That's what she's celebrating.
And my investigations have convinced me that that's exactly the case, that although it may be a rational claim, it may be an enlightenment claim as well, that there's something underneath it that's so much deeper than that to reduce it to mere rationality or to mere enlightenment claim is to do it an immense disservice. And also to fall prey, I would say, to the postmodern quandary, because the postmodern quandary is all belief systems are equally invalid. It's something like that. And that's a real problem when you try to erect a belief system on purely rational axioms. So...
And again, the people on the train, they all have a belief system, and it's all the same. And now, an element of that might all be very postmodern in a certain part. All belief systems are equally invalid, except the ones we don't see that are all around us, that we all agree to. And how do we know we agree to them? Because we're all acting in a certain way. We're even dressing in a certain way. And then when certain key things come up, oh yeah, we're against that, we're for that. I just had a conversation with a young man who... And I don't know, I'll probably post that next week at some time. It's probably on his channel, Gen Z, I forget the name of his channel. But, abortion for him was, he grew up in a very progressive household in a place in Connecticut. And abortion for him was an issue that sort of flipped his worldview around. And so he goes on that nice train thinking, I think abortion is baby killing. Well, go into the South and say, I think a woman's right to choose. She's just talking about diversity and conformity. That's all.
And you can't, besides that, you can't even do it. It's like, I don't respect you as an individual for rational means. The rationality didn't precede my respect for you. It's way deeper than that. It's embodied, for example. It's built into our emotions
you
and
have
our motivations.
This issue with rationalism and the Enlightenment and so on, where you feel that those who appeal to that as somehow we're in this golden age now, are forgetting that it's all built on a much deeper, longer evolutionary psychological history.
Tom Holland is waiting in the wings.
Which is completely different to rationalism per se.
Yeah, well, I see a university professor. Let's take Dawkins, for example. He's the sovereign, rational individual, but there's a wall around him. That's the wall, let's say, of his university, and then outside the university there's the wall of the town, and outside the town there's the wall of the state and the wall of the country, and there's just these concentric rings that are protecting him, and he can stand in the middle and say, well, I'm divorced from all that. It doesn't undergird me. It's like it undergirds you to a degree that you can't possibly imagine, and you're living on the, well, really it is the resources that have been gathered painfully and bloodily in the past, and saying, well, we can just detach ourselves from that and float off. It's like, no, you can't. You don't understand what you're talking about.
All that leads me to gratitude for all that we have. I mean,
Okay, now we get into the gratitude. Okay, what is gratitude? Well, gratitude is a feeling. Okay, well, what is their expressions come with the feeling. Okay, but isn't gratitude finally and fundamentally relational? It's the relational. Someone left a comment. Oh gosh, maybe I should find that comment because it was an astounding comment. Stop the recording. Here's the comment, and it was on an old video. It was on a video from July 2019. What would Jesus do in a zombie apocalypse? And it was with J.P. Marceau about panpsychism. And Stephen Gilcott writes this. I want to make a comment about the Vervaeke video you discussed with JP in this video. Vervaeke's notion of real relations relies heavily on Neoplatonism. Adrian Pabst, a student of John Milbank in the Radical Orthodoxy movement, wrote a hefty book called Metaphysics, The Creation of Hierarchy, where he argues that Aristotle's prioritizing of substance over relation was a mistaken divergence from Plato. Relation is actually primary because individual things can only be what they are by virtue of relations that individuate them. I don't think Vervaeke would go this far because his comment, making everything about emanation, suggests he would critique Neoplatonism by not including enough eminence. I find it interesting that Vervaeke strongly identifies as physicalist. When you talk about real relations, you have effectively got all your spiritual ingredients in your ontology. If relations are physical, then physical can include spiritual. So this version of physicalism doesn't seem to rule out the things that materialists would like to rule out. I'm not exactly sure what Vervaeke rules out with physicalist. Okay, where are we going? Why the comment here with respect to gratitude? Okay, what is gratitude? In a sense, what you have to do to the concept of gratitude is put it within the buffered self. Okay, because gratitude now, and this is what I find again and again from the new atheist tribe that say, I can experience wonder. Well, wonder is merely an emotion. Wonder is merely a biochemical thing going on in the world. And actually for wonder to, I think, reach the fulfillment of the idea of wonder is that wonder connect us with something out there. This again gets into C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. Because, well, now it's just all in here. Now it's just wonder. But gratitude is designed to connect us with something out there. Well, how do you relate to something out there? Now, get back to my idea that you relate to it with the spirit of finesse as a person. Because it's greater than you. And you can't get to the bottom of it, as Jordan Peterson says, with the spirit of geometry. You can't exhaust it. You can't finally colonize it with your mind and reduce it to one of the many things in the whole show. It's something out there that you treat as a person, because actually personal is about the only way you can treat it. Again, at the meetup, I discussed this a little bit. Mike's a very interesting guy. We'll have to see if Rick decides. Rick is Mike's brother, to point this to Mike, because Mike doesn't watch many of my videos anyway. But Mike was talking about AI and persons, and again talking about the idea that persons are, in Vervaekian terms, this very interesting combination of suchness and moreness. Because a person is sort of mapped territory, and once we get to know a person, we sort of imagine that we get to know their patterns enough that we can sort of mind read them and predict them. But there's a moreness to them that even, for example, after 32 years of marriage, my wife will exclaim to me that here after 32 years, I haven't mapped you completely, and I have the same experience of her. So there's both moreness and suchness. And so when you get to something like the real relations that gratitude begs for is not just, I'm having the experience of gratitude. No, and say, no, there should be expression. Okay, I'm expressing gratitude. And basically C.S. Lewis, I think in his book on the Psalms, says, praise is inner health made audible. That in fact, I now stand before something greater than myself, and I approach it with praise and worship and gratitude, and now, because I do such, the world is better for it. That real relational, and I think that is, I don't think we can be divorced from that. And so now she goes off into gratitude, but gratitude to what? What are you going to thank? The dumb universe? Am I going to thank the floor that I am standing on? Or am I going to thank those who made the floor? Because I think in the natural flow of life, we naturally reach out to persons believing that somehow in the future there will be a real relation, a connection with those persons, and it will arrive in triumph. That's what we're longing for. That's what we're looking for. That's what we're looking for in meaning.
I recognize that leads.
Detach ourselves from that and float off. It's like, no, you can't. You don't understand what you're talking about.
All that leads me to gratitude for all that we have. I mean, I recognize that. I recognize that nothing to do with any religious basis at all.
Gratitude to the other people. Okay, they're dead. They can't hear you. They're zipped. Gratitude for what? Gratitude's just hanging out there. Who do you have to thank?
I recognize that I could not come on the train here, have a really interesting discussion, meet Justin again, have a nice glass of cool water, without a load of other people doing it for me. That gratitude, which is one of the things that you quite rightly put into your book, it gives good place to it, and it's very important.
But it's not just an emotion. It's a dance. It's something that we relate to, and it is in some ways fruitless if it can't relate back.
That doesn't come from anything religious, unless you say because I was brought up a Christian, it came from there. But I don't base it on that anymore.
What do you think it comes from?
I think it comes from a recognition that I've done a lot of meditation. I've meditated every day for 30 years, and I think this has something to do with it.
Oh, there's going to be some religion sneaking in. How clean did you get that meditation? Did you get all the religious stuff off that meditation tool that you're using? I doubt it. I bet you it goes down.
But it's observing the inner consequences of different ways of confronting the world. And I'm much more in recent years in the habit of waking up in the morning, even if it's raining in January in England, and looking out and going, oh, and it's a feeling of gratitude, not gratitude towards God or towards anybody or anything, just free-floating gratitude.
I think that's fruitless. I think it's fruitless.
That seems to have a positive consequence.
Because if I'm grateful to my wife or to my neighbor, I want to stand before my wife and say thank you. Or if I'm grateful to you, my audience, I want to say thank you for your time and attention. It begs, I can't help but work this way.
I set the day up better, and it's kind of self-perpetuating. It pops up again and again.
Do you think you can just have gratitude in general, or must gratitude always be given towards something and ultimately God?
That's a good question. That goes back to our discussion about acting things out. Like, gratitude is something you feel towards something. And you can say, well, I don't feel it towards anything in particular. And I would say, all right, well, the diffuse nothing that you feel it towards serves in your psychological hierarchy as your equivalent of God.
There. You're acting as if that's your God. That's your religion W. And again, Peterson's scientific, speaking from a psychological perspective, basically says, I usually put it in scare quotes, God is basically a necessary element of the culture net that you cannot divorce yourself from. We will keep making new ones. John Calvin, our hearts are perpetual idol factories because we keep needing to plug something into the equation that fits that way. Now, okay, so you're going to have your own personal God. Well, it's a whole lot more fun if you actually have other people that you're doing this with. And it's in fact actually a whole lot more fun if you can have people in the past that you're in continuity with. And it's a whole lot more fun if you can, at the end of the book of Revelation, for example, imagine the universe celebrating the triumph of God over evil and all of the ways that history has fallen short and everything being made right. That's way more fun than I have a feeling of gratitude.
No, but it's gratitude. This morning, for example, I looked out and it was so green. We've had frosts and it's been white the last few days, and it was green this morning. And it was just gratitude to the universe, if you like. It's not.
We always fudge. To the universe. Okay. You're going to talk to the universe now? You're going to be Verizon. What's her name? Why can't I have Verizon? Oh, thanks, universe. And I see people doing that all the time. I left church because I can't believe in God. Thanks, universe, for bringing me to the Verizon store to buy that smartphone. Thanks. Oh, the universe is bringing me this. I hear it all the time. These post-Christian people, they're always talking about the universe this and the universe that, and the universe told them. And it's like, you just can't keep this atheism stuff up, really, can you? Because you're talking about the universe, and pretty soon you're going to name it. Because universe, it's like keeping your dog named Dog, and you're going to name it. Well, I like thinking about the universe as Fred, and I like thinking about it. It's just going to grow. But then you're just going to have your own little religion, and the other people on the train are going to have other religions, and what you really want to do is walk into a place where you're all on the same page, and so then you've got the norms, and everything's going, and Peterson's exactly right. You're always negotiating and working out, and that's always going on.
Not really God, because it's not a creator. It's not anything I can.
You were just thanking him that the grass was green instead of white. Well, it's the sun, and it all boils up to that. No, it just happens. Oh, okay.
Pray to it. I mean, I know.
Why feel
Why aren't you practically praying to it then? That's not anything different from when we get in church and I say, what shall we pray for together? We praise God that the air is clear and the smoke is gone and the fires are getting under control. Well, you can praise the California firemen. You can praise the fact that we get the wind from the west instead of from the north. You can praise the fact that winter is coming and rains will start to fall on California soon. And. What's the sum total of all of those systems? God, number one. That's why we thank him. That's why we praise him. And I can point to point after point in the Heidelberg Catechism that if you just change some of the words, you'd say, oh, that's not religious at all. Really? The scrubbing that you're doing on these things in order to try and get the religion off doesn't work because it's built in from the inside.
Gratitude.
Because it's not a creator. It's not anything I can pray to. I know.
Why feel gratitude towards it then?
I don't know, but I find
That's
it.
Fine.
I know that you tackle in this book that happess is not an ultimate good, and I struggle this
way. It's just not an ultimate goal.
Oh, okay.
I didn't say it wasn't an ultimate
all
good.
All right. Okay.
There's a big difference between those
things. You're right. You picked me up correctly on that. Nevertheless, we are happiness-seeking creatures, and I have found through practice and growing older that acting gratitude, thinking gratitude, feeling gratitude.
And now she's giving it away to Jordan right here, and he's just looking at her with that look on his face like, I made my point. You're making my point for me.
Attitude makes me happier and seems to kind of
so
rub off on other people.
So
I don't
think we are happiness-seeking creatures, and I think it's a low goal. Not because there's something wrong with being happy, because, thank God if you get to be happy now and then. But I don't think that that's what we seek. I think we seek a meaning that's deep enough to sustain us through tragedy. And that is way different.
Do you know, when I hit tragedy is too strong a word. I think...
Not for Jordan's life.
But when horrible things happen to me, or I feel, or I read some terrible thing...
Because, again, you read 12 Rules for Life, and you get to the section where he's talking about Michaela and her medical situations. And, again, she says, well, you don't know childbirth. Well, I really hope it's true for you, Susan, that you don't know the kind of pain that Jordan went through. While he didn't give birth to Michaela, a parent who loves their child and watches their child suffer and watches their child, hold up nobly under suffering and go in and that book, the reason I say Maps of Meaning is a tortured book is it's a tortured book. Jordan is wrestling with suffering in the world, and Jordan comes out and says, let me tell you something. Just seeking happiness won't deal with suffering. You have to seek meaning in it and through it. But how? Not if you're an Epicurean. Not if you're happiness seeking. It simply won't work. And just like you say, well, Jordan, you don't know childbirth, Jordan can say, yeah, you don't know how to bear up under suffering.
Going on in the world. Yes, those are tragedies going on in the world. My response is, nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. This is how the world is. Get used to it.
And here's the thing. I have talked to how many people that nihilism, in those brave moments. And again, and maybe they're having the feeling and they're in a good mood and they say, okay, I'm going to bear up under nihilism. But what about those other dark times when everything's been beating you down and you say, nothing happens or nothing matters. There's no purpose to this. I'm suffering. I'm going to end it all. And as I spoke with that young man yesterday, that I'll post that video at some point, of course. And it's probably already up on his channel. What's the only decision? To live or not to live? Well, if I'm suffering and there's no purpose to life, why don't I end it? And then suddenly even the atheists will come around and say, no, don't do it. Well, why not? Well, why? Because life has a purpose. Because there is meaning. And, well, it might change. Yeah, it might change. But what's really going on?
Get on with it, girl.
That sounds like a very Zen Buddhist way of dealing.
I guess it is.
Meaning.
Well, it's a paradoxical way, though. Because
paradoxical.
The first part of that is nihilistic, and the second part isn't. So how do you reconcile those two things? Why get on with it, girl?
Because well, here's another thing. I've often done this with my students. Let's suppose you become nihilistic. Nothing matters. There's no point in doing it. I mean, I think we live in a pointless universe. What are you going to do? And I say to them, like William James in his wonderful thing about getting up in the morning, but that's a slightly different point that he makes there. But I say to them, okay, tomorrow morning, when you wake up, think it's all pointless. There's no point in doing anything. Now, what are you going to do? Well, actually, you're going to need to go to the loo. You're going
to relieve the suffering of your full bladder.
Get out of bed and you're going to go to the bathroom. And when you're there, you'll think, actually, I'm hungry. I think I want to go down
to relieve the suffering of your hunger.
Kitchen. I probably.
So you're basically living your life relieving little sufferings. What happens when the suffering that is causing that the suffering that you're experiencing is being, at least in your own mind, caused by another person over there? How are you going to relieve that suffering? Well, that happens all the time, and it's not a good thing.
I should put my slippers on. Why don't I get dressed? You go and have something to eat, and then you think, I'm bored, and you go to university and go into your lectures. And we are not creatures who will just not do anything. To me, to go through that process.
You don't have a son living in your basement covered with Cheetos playing video games all the time?
Process, which I've done in the past a lot, and it's just natural now, is a very positive way of living. To accept the meaningless and ultimate emptiness of everything, and accept that this creature here, this thing, this evolved creature just will get on with life.
But you're not accepting the meaninglessness of it, even by going through those actions that you described.
You don't think so?
Not at all, because because you're acting as if those things are meaningful.
Yes, I am. I'm
Right.
acting
Okay.
as though
So
those things
let-
are
You're
okay.
pretending
So
that
let-
they're meaningful?
Pardon?
Are you pretending that they're meaningful?
No, I'm not pretending. My way of putting it would be that those meanings are constructed by myself and others.
They're personal
and they're
meanings rather than...
because the kind of creatures we are, because of the meme
Religion W.
But they're not
plexes,
constructed.
I'd like to hear
Hunger
Jordan's
isn't
response to this.
constructed. Neither is your desire to use the loo. None of that's
No,
constructed.
no. But the fact that there is a loo is part
Yes.
of culture.
Yeah, well,
And
thank
the
God
fact
for that.
You know,
Yeah. But see-
oh, you
see-
thank God, would you,
see-
for that? Sorry, that's a poor joke.
Well, you see, so imagine this. You have the proximal meanings that you described that are sort of a priori, right?
Yeah.
They're handed to you. You might consider them as needs or drives, although they're
Yes.
not. They're personalities. That's not the right way of conceptualizing them. But then there's the intermingling of all those needs and drives, let's say, and that constitutes a new layer of structure, because it isn't just that you have to eat and that you have to use the washroom and that you have to have something to drink and that you have to be warm enough or cool enough to survive. It's that you have to do all those things at the same time in a situation where you're going to have to propagate that across time, and you're going to have to do it with a bunch of other people. Yep. And it's always been like that. And so what that means is that out of those proximal meanings, higher meanings arise. And you might say, well, those meanings are arbitrary. And I would think those are religious
I wouldn't
meanings.
say they are arbitrary, but I would say they were constructed. It's very interesting. Reading your
What
book...
do you mean by constructed?
Well, they are a consequence of mimetic evolution, of the language that people are brought up in, the culture they live in, the arguments they have. I mean,
What about the biology that they're given?
well, we start with the biology, and the memes build on top of that. Culture
The
builds
memes are
on top.
biology too.
Well, by definition, they are. Well,
See, this is the thing.
I would follow Dawkins in saying, well, talk about genes as biology, talk about memes as culture. That's all I meant by dividing that. But let me say this.
Yeah, but I don't accept that division.
But I want.
Because again, if you get back into that one moment right before they got into 12 rules, well, the culture gets into the genes, and the two develop together.
To get back to what we're saying about meaning, reading your book made me think a lot about what you mean by meaning, and your claim that we should.
She's a smart woman. She should have read this book.
Have a meaningful life, or strive for a meaningful life, that meaningfulness is important. And I kept asking myself, do I live that way? What meanings does my life have? And, if I think of something like, well, most of my striving goes into writing my books.
Why? Because it feels meaningful to propagate an idea out there. Well, and you don't even think of it. You don't even take the step back, kind of a second order knowledge where you say, oh, that's meaning. That's what I'm doing. You just do it.
And is that meaningful? And again, I have the same response when I ask myself that question. It's just what this body does.
Then you should listen to the body and stop listening to the thing that's criticizing it.
And what would the body say?
It would say, write your book and try to be as clear as you possibly can
that's
about
what I
it.
do. And that's
Right, but this is
exactly what I do.
What I said at the beginning is that the atheist types act out a religious structure and criticize
there's
it.
no religious structure.
Again, religion S. She says there's no religious structure. That's what she understands by religion. Jordan says all of this stuff that has developed from all of those needs and all of that stuff that developed, that's religion W. That's what the fight is between these two.
Let me get to this
question, because I did want to get to this, because you have a fascinating part in your book, Jordan, where you do say this. You're simply not addressing atheists. You say you're simply not an atheist in your actions, and it is your actions.
Or if you are, look out.
And it is your actions that most accurately reflect your religious beliefs. What do you mean by that? Why are you saying that no one is really an atheist deep down?
I didn't say no one was.
Okay.
I said that most of the people who claim to be atheists aren't. So this is why I like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, because Raskolnikov tried to act like an atheist, right? He took the ideas that were floating around, Dostoevsky took the ideas that were floating around in the late 1800s, which are still the ideas that we're discussing today. One most fundamental idea, I suppose, being after Nietzsche's announcement of the death of God, that if there is no God, then anything is permitted. That was Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov's the criminal in Crime and Punishment, the murderer. He gets away with his murder, technically, but not psychologically. And he decides that if there's no God, anything is permitted.
But
and
this
he can't
doesn't
see
have
a reason.
to be true. That's a person in a character in a novel. I don't think that's so.
Well, let's hear the end of that story. And what what do you take away from what Dostoevsky has to say about?
Well, Dostoevsky's takeaway was that there was a moral law that Raskolnikov was breaking, even though he rationalized his way through it. Like, he committed the perfect murder, right? He murdered a woman who people would have voted to murder, and then he got away with it. And he did it for good reasons, at least reasons that he could rationalize as good. And then he got away with it, but it destroyed his soul. And Dostoevsky's right about that. And one of the things I like about Dostoevsky as compared to Nietzsche, say, because I think Dostoevsky is the profounder of the two, is that in the Brothers Karamazov, for example, Ivan is the atheist, and Ivan is everything you'd want a man to be, like, seriously. And Dostoevsky, man, he doesn't straw man his opponents. The most powerful characters in his books are always the opponents of what he himself believes. And Ivan is always arguing with Alyosha, who's his younger brother, who's a monastic novitiate and really can't articulate himself very well, has nowhere near the force or charisma of Ivan. But Alyosha wins the drama, even though he loses all the arguments. And that's where Dostoevsky is so great. It's like, and this is what you're doing in your life. You're acting out the logos, Susan. That's what you're doing. You're writing books to illuminate the world.
Yes.
You say, well, I don't believe in that.
From a place
Yes, you
of
do.
meaninglessness.
Don't you think it's kind of offensive to say to me that I'm not an atheist when I am?
When I identify as one. So don't offend. Oh, come on.
Why don't answer me this question? Why do you think I don't go around murdering people? Why do you think I go around trying to be?
He takes a look. Well, let me see if I can figure that out. Because you're a wonderful, nice human being. I mean, she clearly is. Listen to her. She's just absolutely delightful. But
I don't know you well enough to know.
Yes, I could have done something.
I think often the reason that people don't do it is because they're too cowardly.
Oh, that could be a reason. It could be that I don't murder people. I'd really
No,
love
I'm not
to.
necessarily saying
No, it's a possible one.
It's
All
in
right,
fact
all right.
highly likely at
Yes.
some times in your life
But
if you're a
it's
normal
very-
person.
We're needing to close things out, and
Dear, the end
I
already.
know it's we've had not long enough, but Jordan, just come back to this because I want to hear why ultimately, despite everything that Sue said there, you still think she's behaving as though there is, in some sense, a God or some ultimate meaning, even though she protests that no, that's simply
Well, I would
not
say
part of
she's
her
acting
worldview.
it out. Well,
again, that there's a super thing. No, it's well, what is this religion? Religion W.
for example, the act of writing a book. I mean, the Judeo-Christian culture is the culture of the book. It's the revelation of the proper mode of being in written form. It's not only that, but it's a large part of that. It's the culture of the book. You're acting out the culture of the book. It's thousands of years old, and the true voice in the culture of the book is the logos. That's what it is, technically speaking. And so she's acting out the logos and writing a book. It's like, and then she says, well, I don't believe in God. It's like, okay, that's fine.
The logos, of
Acting
course,
like you do is fine.
in
That will
Scripture, in the New Testament, is
The word.
is brought into the Word, and it, of course,
It's
relates
the word
to
that brings order out
and,
of chaos.
to Jesus Christ as
Yes.
the sort of personification almost of that.
Right. He's the archetypal manifestation of the logos.
I mean,
That's-
these are all big words and things. I mean, a lot of people will be asking, what do you actually make of, in Christian terms, the figure of Jesus? Do you believe that he was in some sense divine? Was there, when you look at...
See, now when you get to this point, if you want to speak Peterson, and I think now in our cultural moment, Christians are always going to default to, is he the Son of God? And again, you're thinking the super thing, he's the son of the super thing? We're going to have to slow down and talk about this language and ask, okay, what are we talking about here?
What the Bible tells us about Jesus.
Well, one thing you might ask yourself is, do you believe that each individual is divine in some sense? And I would say, well, perhaps not, but you act as though you do. And our law...
See, divine or sacred? Because I think it's easy to say sacred because people will say, well, each individual human's life is sacred. And that is a phrase that is in our culture, and we're okay with that. And if you were asked Susan Blackmore that, she would probably agree with it too. But then again, you get to abortion, and well, that's not the snuffing out of that aborted baby is justifiable because we have a real assumption that baby will suffer. But now we're over into other territories too, because tell me what baby of even the best home won't suffer?
acts as if it does. It's predicated on that idea. But you believe that each individual is divine in some sense. And I would say, well, perhaps not, but you act as though you do. And our law acts as if it does. It's predicated on that idea, because the sovereignty of the individual is the divinity of the individual. There's no difference between those two.
See, and I would tweak that and say that the sovereignty of the individual is the sacredness of the individual. Well, okay, you're going to connect sacred with divine, okay, but again, it's theology is trying to figure out how to communicate with these terms that we are given, no matter how sloshy they are.
Two things, and I can make an absolutely brutally clear case for the development of that idea historically. I've traced it back to Mesopotamia, at least in its earliest written forms. I mean, originally the only real sovereign individuals were the sovereigns, right?
That's why we called them sovereigns.
Emperors and pharaohs. But that the idea of the sovereign individual descended down the hierarchy of power, so to speak, until with Christianity it was universalized. We're each sovereign individuals, and that means that the law itself is written as if we each contain a spark of divinity. And so then I think, well, what is that divinity? And in the Christian worldview, well, that's the logos. That's the true speech.
Well, see, I would say, well, there's personhood. Well, what is that personhood? So it's the person and our reflection of that person. It's the image of God, spark of the divinity that has its own, and I've been complaining about that, what Jordan calls it. I don't think it's the best formulation, but I think we understand what he means.
That brings forth habitable and good order from the chaos of potential.
And in your view, whether she likes it or not, Sue is at some level a benefactor of that reality of what
not a contributor, not only much better than merely being a benefactor, an active contributor. It's no easy thing to write a book and to get your thoughts straight and to put them forward into the world.
But she couldn't do it without this idea, in a sense, of God. That
she doesn't need the idea, even it's embodied. She's acting it out.
The one of the consequences of the way I've been thinking about it, and Sam Harris talks about this too, is the way I think about it prevents me going, ooh, I'm so clever, I've written a brilliant book. I mean, it doesn't always. I have those thoughts come up, but I've got quite good.
Well, before speaking, it was wrong. It was morally wrong to feel bad about yourself. Now it's morally wrong to feel good about yourself. I completely understand both senses, but
at seeing them coming up and going, oh, there comes that thought again, because I'm taking the view that these books the memes are doing it through this organism.
So when your publisher comes to gift your royalty check, you say, oh no, it was the memes.
Yeah, and I have
that
fun.
That would be the eternal logos manifesting itself.
All right, if you want to.
But I'm not playing games. Like, that's the oldest language we have for that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And the logos that I'm talking about is the integration of those motivational forces that you were describing. It's not merely a meme. Like, that's where Dawkins is wrong about that. There isn't biology and memes. The interactions matter. They're crucial. Some of these memes are millions of years old.
But you've slipped away, if I can bring you back to Justin's question, really, because you slithered out of it, I think, in your question was...
Because she wants to nail him to the super thing argument, okay? Jordan, yes or no, super thing. And Jordan is saying that's the wrong conceptualization of what we mean by this word God. And again, in a few months later, Jordan would be sitting with Sam Harris, and it would come to a point. And so, Jordan, what do you mean by God? And he opens up his Surface Book and he starts reading those things. And Sam's like, no, that's not God. It's a super thing. That's God. And Jordan's like, no. And Brett's sort of in the middle, says, I kind of understand what Jordan is saying.
Was Jesus different from the rest of us by saying, oh, we've all got a spark of divinity? But do you then believe that Jesus was somehow divine in a sense that's other than what I am? What was it, did he do?
Ooh, now she's really knocking at the door.
Miracles? Was he, all of that stuff that
quick
makes
answer, and then we'll finish with a final question.
Quick answer.
Justin, this is YouTube. Go full Joe Rogan.
How about this? Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. That's a miracle. That's the separation of church and state in one sentence. So there's a miracle for you.
We're going to go for...
to ingest a sound bite. What did Tom Holland say about Jesus? Was it in my conversation with him? I think it was. I should go back and look at that conversation and do some clipping in there, because, you know, basically what Tom Holland says about Jesus is the greatest short storyteller ever. And Jordan Peterson, okay, here you've laid something in his lap that he does not want to avoid answering, must answer, and so let's just take the words of Jesus and put them there. And yeah.
A final question. I'm going to ask it for both of you, which is the question we began with. We're talking about the psychology of belief. Do we need God to make sense of life?
And do we need God? Well, what do you mean, Justin? Do we need the idea of God? That's basically what Peterson is saying. And she's going to answer, do we need the super thing in order to make sense of life? That's how they're both going to, that's what they're both going to hear.
1 minute answer begins now. Sue?
Absolutely not. That will do for an answer.
Okay. Do we need God to make sense of life, Jordan?
Well, God is what you use to make sense of your life, by definition.
Right there. That's actually a really good summation of Jordan and God speaking from a psychological point of view.
To make sense of life, Jordan?
Well, God is what you use to make sense of your life, by definition. This is one of the things I learned from Jung. The highest value, you have a hierarchy of values. You have to. Otherwise, you can't act, or you're painfully confused. You have a hierarchy of values. Whatever is at the top of that hierarchy of values serves the function of God for you. Now, it may be a God that you don't believe in, or a God that you can't name, but it doesn't matter, because it's God for you. And what you think about God has very little impact on how God is acting within you, whatever God it is that you happen to be, let's say, following.
Jordan Peterson's best Jordan Peterson definition of God. That is who God is to Jordan Peterson. It's right there. He says it, bang, right there.
It's been fascinating to share this time with you both. Thank you so much for being with me.
And that's the video. I commented on, well, 4636. Justin will kind of wrap it up nicely, as Justin does. So there it is. Don't know how long this was. I did this in 4 separate sittings. I usually don't like doing commentary videos like that. But again, I just haven't had the expansive amount of time to sit down and do these. So I hope it's not too discontinuous. I'll post it tomorrow, and we'll see. So thanks for watching. Thank you for your time and attention. If you want to support the channel, you can support Living Stones Church. That's one way to do it. There's Patreon. There's all kinds of other ways. So thank you. I hope this has been helpful.